And to kick us off, Richard, it's a term that's banded about a fair amount, so it'd be really useful if you could just describe what we mean when we talk about the built environment.
Okay, well, I guess at its simplest, the built environment is everything that it's the cities and the infrastructure that powers those, the cities that we live in, the towns that we live in, and it operates on different scales. So for the purposes of our work with the foundation, we talk about 5 different scales. There's the component scale. Mm-hmm. We're talking about individual assemblies and systems and buildings. We're talking about furniture. We're talking about other pieces of equipment. There's the building scale themselves, and buildings, of course, last anything from sort of 6 months to many centuries. There are infrastructure systems which connect buildings together and help form our cities, and those systems are sort of transport, water, energy, waste management, and communications. And then there's a district level, so when you're talking about neighborhoods and districts and whole cities as well. And finally, there's sort of a national economy scale when the cities come together, mm-hmm. and you have inter-city kind of infrastructure connections as well.
Great, but for this session today, because obviously that would be quite a lot to cover in one session, and we're talking around building a positive business case for built environment practitioners. What particular scale are we going to be?
So for the purposes of today, we're talking about buildings, mm-hmm. and we're talking about real estate. So buildings are things that we obviously sort of design, live, work, play, do various other things in, and real estate, I guess, is the set of businesses and the finances and the economics around buildings and cities. And so when we're talking about the business case for circular economy in the built environment, when we think about buildings, we also need to think about real estate.
Perfect. Brilliant.
But basically what we do in GXN is that we do architectural research. So we're looking at some of the challenges we think are going to face our industry and going to face the built environment, and then try and figure out, how can we solve these? So we get to do all the stuff that architects don't really get to do day to day. We get to be the geeks. We get to be excited about new technology, try out stuff we don't know works, see if it works. If it doesn't, learn from our failures. We also get to ask open-ended questions, questions we don't know how to answer, and we get to work with a lot of different partners. And I think that's probably one of the key things in our approach is that we believe that some of the challenges we're facing are too big to solve alone. So we need to solve them in collaborative partnerships, working with you guys, working with Arup, working with everybody else who might hold a piece of the puzzle.
Brilliant. Great. Okay, well, let's get into it then. So, Richard, built environment, what is the problem that we're trying to solve with our built environment, our buildings and our real estate?
Okay, so at the minute, the built environment globally is facing sort of 2 or 3 real sort of mega trends that are going to transform the cities and the way that we live in cities in the future. The first is rapid urbanization. So between now and 2050, the urban population of the world is set to grow by about 2.4 billion people. The growth of the built environment required to accommodate those new inhabitants is going to drive significant growth in material demand. So by 2050, we expect demand for steel to double. We expect demand for cement to grow by up to 76%. To put that in sort of slightly more real terms, that growth, that amount of floor space is equivalent to 1 billion homes. That floor space is equivalent to a new New York City every 35 days for 30 years.
Wow.
So we're talking about a huge amount of growth, a huge amount of activity. But most of that growth is going to take place in lower middle income countries in the developing world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Here in the high income world, in places like the UK, we face a slightly different challenge. So London as a city is facing accommodating an extra 2.4 million people by 2041. With already existing sort of legacy, potentially low performance infrastructure. So about 87% of the buildings that will be standing in London in 2050 have already been built. And at the same time as these 2 big trends, sort of one of aging infrastructure, one of rapid urbanization, they're both playing out against the imperative to decarbonize our economy to achieve a net zero carbon built environment. And that's something that we're more and more aware of at the moment, and is really sort of top of mind, top of agenda for lots of people here. So these 3 challenges taken together makes it clear to me, and the work that I'm doing at Arup, that we need new ways to design the built environment. And for us, circular economy and the ideas and the principles of a circular economy provide us both the tool and the inspiration for finding those new ways of delivering buildings and real estate.
Yeah.
In my own experience, I believe everybody is understanding and is aware of the problem. And we can also see that there's now social pressures and growing political pressures for us to change. So I don't think many people in the industry are looking at the world right now and not thinking that we need to change how we work. So I think the question is more figuring out how can we create new models that allow us to work better together and allow us to incentivize the right choices in ways that makes it easier to actually make them. I'm very sure that most people in the industry know we have to change and are keen to find ways of changing. It's just a question of going from that top level awareness to day-to-day choice making.
Yeah. Okay. And so, Richard, that's something obviously that Arup also recognise and have partnered with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on, because we see the circular economy as the framework to be able to start working out how to break down some of these barriers and create that sort of platform for change. So can you just tell us a bit about then what the research is that we've been working on around that and kind of building up those different business models that Kåre was referring to?
Yeah, so together for the past 2 years or so, we've been working on a project called Principles to Practices. And that's been explicitly trying to take the principles of a circular economy, clearly articulated by the foundation, and apply them and translate them into everyday built environment practices. So things that really tangible changes that built environment practitioners can make in their day-to-day jobs. So that project has sort of, over its course, looked sort of at very broadly around Europe in 5 different cities and interviewed over 100 different stakeholders across the built environment value chain, from investors and real investment trusts at one end through to the demolition industry and the end-of-life industry at the other. And what came really clearly out of that sort of initial exploration exercise was there needs to be a clearer articulation of the business case for real estate people, for investors, and for construction clients. Because as Kåre has mentioned, we're confident, we know people would like to change, they just need to be able to make the case and demonstrate there are short-term as well as long-term benefits to changing. There are good reasons almost why it made economic sense to build the built environment the way we have done. It's not that this is, we've been getting it wrong all this time, but for circular economy to really be made to happen in our sector, we need new capabilities and we need to do things differently. And digital technology gives us the ability to do things differently. Yeah. It gives us the ability through Internet of Things to monitor the performance of building systems in real time. I know how much energy my lights are using. I know when users are demanding light. I know when users are demanding heat. We see smart thermostats like Nest in places. We've seen remote sensing, individually controlled lamps coming in, all controlled through Wi-Fi and radio, and using machine learning algorithms to adapt those systems to how users actually use their buildings. And so if we're looking to pay by performance, and we're able to record performance in real time, then that's how that is made to happen. So
I'd be interested to hear from your point of view, when you've been talking about these new ways of doing business, how has that landed with your clients, and have you had those sorts of conversations yet?
So we have some projects where we've had these conversations and have actually been implementing some of the tools we can use to achieve these. So I think the first thing to say from a design perspective about these business models, whether it's flexible space, adaptable assets, temporary buildings, or residual value, is that it requires a new way of designing and constructing our buildings for us to be able to actually go out and harvest the value potential that is in here. So from a design perspective, that's really what we're focusing on. So we believe that the best possibility for actually making a circular building is in the design phase. This is where we got to get a lot of choices right. We got to make sure that we prepare the buildings for these future business models that we want to put in. So for us, we've been working with this for a long time. We've just put out a 3rd edition of our sort of manual on this. And this really explains which sort of overall tools we are looking at. So for us, we're specifically looking at design for disassembly. So a very simple question: how do we design our buildings in ways that means we can take them apart and use the components again? Right now, we are basically putting buildings together with a lot of adhesives, concrete, glues and binders, which means that we can't really take the components apart and everything is crushed and really loses value, and we need to create new products and components. So if we can design the building smarter, we can actually take the components apart and we can reuse them, resell the materials, or use them to create more flexible buildings where we can move stuff around. So that's really the first strategy that we're using. We're also looking into the notion of material passports. So as Richard was saying, in London, in Copenhagen, in these cities, a large part of the built environment that will be here in 30 years is already here. The big challenge is we have no idea what's in there. We don't know we don't know how many materials. We don't know the level of poisonous materials. Things that we would be using in the 70s now know that we shouldn't be using anymore. We don't know the state of the materials. So when we talk about circular economy from a design perspective, really looking at two challenges. One is what do we do with the buildings we already have? Another one is how do we design for what we're going to have in the future? And for the last thing, the other big thing besides design for disassembly is material passports. We want to make sure that in the future we know what's in the built environment. We want to know what's in the buildings. So we look at ways we can track the materials and track their health through the lifetime, so that information can actually enable a market for secondary materials, or enable a portfolio owner to see what buildings they have and how they might be adapted in case they need that. And then the last thing we're looking at in the book and increasingly in real life projects is the economy side of circular economy. This needs to make business sense.
So we're talking about the building a positive business case, and we've just had some examples from Kåre around sort of two projects that they've worked on which have ended up proving that money can be saved, carbon emissions can be saved, it's a win-win. But I guess the question is, those are isolated examples, how are we really going to scale this, and who are the stakeholders that we need to really get on board to make that happen?
So it comes back, I think, to the business case. So we have taken each of those 5 models I talked through, and we've applied them to each one of 5 testbed projects. These are real projects being pursued by real clients across 5 cities in Europe. One's in London, one's in Milan, one's in Amsterdam, one's in Berlin, and one is in Aarhus in Denmark. And what we've done is that we've reimagined those projects using our models, and we are doing a financial analysis on the improvement in investment value. What is the better business case for each of those projects if it had considered our circular economy business models from the beginning?
This is basically because at the moment you see the key stakeholders, investors, clients, they basically don't believe that there is a business case. Is that what it is? Have you had that direct feedback?
I think there's just an ambivalence. I think there's as Kåre said, there's a willingness to believe there is a business case. There's just these are financially numbers-minded people, and so by creating these test cases and running some feasibility level numbers on it and articulating in terms of an improved internal return on investment or rate of return or a reduction in cost, we can sort of put in cold hard cash the beneficial impact on the bottom line for adopting circular economy principles in this sector. And what we're hoping that will do, or what we're looking to do with those results, is disseminate them to the real estate investment and the construction client communities, because we know that increasingly this community is concerned about their carbon footprint. We've mentioned some of the emissions statistics already, but the key materials for the built environment, steel contributes 5% of global CO2 emissions. Cement contributes about 7 to 8 of global CO2 emissions. Put that in context, global aviation as a whole is only 2%. So we're really talking about huge climate footprint. So if we can bring a set of business models to clients that help them achieve their net zero carbon objectives and also improves their bottom line and delivers an improved business case for the projects, I think we can really start to see a case that could be really, really compelling for these stakeholders. What do we want them to do with it? Well, we want them to start to apply it at commercial scale on real projects. We've seen plenty of pilots and demonstrators. Arup delivered the circular building at the London Design Festival. That was an installation that was up for 3 weeks, designed around returning materials to the supply chain in the condition that they were received in. we've seen an increasing number of retrofit projects like 3XN's tower in Sydney, like One Triton Square with British Land in London, that are sort of delivering market-leading spaces, really competitive letting rates and rents, but on like a fraction of the carbon footprint or a fraction of the material footprint of what a new build would have been. So we want to say, let's start to apply it not just on individual projects. Well, let's start to pilot it first. Let's pilot it on real projects, demonstrate that business case, demonstrate the evidence base for that this can really be achieved on real projects, iron out any of the issues, and there will be issues, but we can work together through collaboration to innovate. Kåre's mentioned the kind of network that they are using on Circle House to sort of work out problems together collectively, and we just need to demonstrate that it'll work.
But from your point of view, like going into a meeting room to sort of suggest this to a client, like what is the key thing that you think will win them over? Is it that the bottom line, the financial line, or is it the whole story around the environmental value and the social value that comes with it as well? What is the real sticking point?
If I could give you just one, I mean, I'm not particularly keen on doing that. I think you gotta have that larger case behind you when you're coming in with this. But I think in terms of having a conversation with the client, I think what we need is actually having a closer conversation. I think there's still a gap for us in terms of understanding developers and investors, understanding which projects this might fit for. So one thing we got to be aware is that basically in the built environment you have large amounts of money. There are very long time scales, and there's a high degree of, as I said before, complexity, stuff you don't know, things will go wrong, and risks scale quickly within this environment, right? So understanding and having a dialogue with different types of investors for specific projects, understanding, for this specific project, what's the risk profile you're willing to go in? What's the payback periods? What are the business models you're looking at? And then being able to tailor make the solutions. I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all. I think it's going to be very project based. And so what I think is really needed is more of a conversation with the client around these things. And to back that conversation up, I think it's great to have the calculated cases, have the projects, being able to show that it works. I think that's an absolute key. So what we need to be able to do better from the architect's point of view is documenting value creation. We got to be able to show that we did this and it created this value for this specific project. Our solution could solve this for you and turn a problem into this sort of feature for your project or whatever it is. But we need to be able to have the documentation and through that documentation have a conversation where we understand the needs of the specific project and the specific client better. So I think it's really a question of trying to bring people around the table in a different way. And I think so that's why I'm saying we also need that larger story. I think what we're going to be seeing is larger pressures coming in. Richard's example of WeWork kind of changing expectations to office environments is pretty good, right? It used to be that if you're a real estate developer doing offices, you just put that risk onto the client. Refurb, that's you take the lease out for 20 years. If you want to change anything, that's your problem. You got to pay for that. WeWork changed that expectations within a very, very short time frame, meaning that most developers are now working, looking at ways of meeting those expectations. So expectations change quickly. We're seeing a lot of attention around our general ways of living, building, working, and how that impacts the climate and how that impacts the planet. So I think we're going to see changing expectations, and I think we're going to see those changing expectations come in new building codes and new laws. And I think the most forward-thinking companies should start looking at this now because it's moving faster than we think. In Denmark, we have a new government come in half a year ago. They upped the sort of the goal. So we want to do in Denmark now a 70% reduction in emissions by 2030. So that's in 10 years. We don't know what codes they're going to come out with to achieve that goal, but if they're serious about that ambition, it's going to change how we do things. We're going to have to introduce new standards, new building codes, and the people who are sort of moving first on this can reap the benefits rather than sort of be thrown under the bus once the change comes. So I think that's the burning platform that we can use to initialize the conversation and then have the conversation around a specific project using these value cases to show that, you know, it actually works.
Yeah.